Hello and welcome to this episode of NewsClick's Mapping Faultlines. In this show, we look at key geopolitical developments and their impact across the world. Today, we'll be talking about the impeachment of Donald Trump, the proceedings that are happening right now, and its implications on the politics of the region where Russia and Ukraine are located. To talk more about this, we have with us Prabir Purkayastha. Hello, Prabir. Prabir, so this week is a key week for the impeachment proceedings. The US House Judiciary Committee is going to drop the articles of impeachment. First of all, they're going to see if there is a case for impeachment in the first place. And we'll get to that a bit later. But before that, a lot of the narrative that was going on during the impeachment proceedings, the hearing of the witnesses, was about how the so-called quid pro quo efforts of Trump ended up weakening a crucial ally that was Ukraine, which was a bulwark of, force against Russian aggression. And that was the whole narrative that was being peddled. So could we talk a bit about what exactly is the kind of so-called bulwark that Ukraine is, and what is the situation there?
First is we don't really understand the United States politics sitting from outside, because we seem to have originally seen the Republicans as a party of war. And the only people, therefore, who could do peace were the Republicans, because anything the Democrats do would then be really targeted as surrender to the Russians, to the Chinese, to the Reds, and so on. From that, we now seem to see Democrats as a party of war, which is now saying there should be no peace with Russia, and everything should be in the proceedings from the prism of Russia subverting our key allies, and Ukraine is being now talked about. Now, interestingly enough, Ukraine is not officially an American ally. In fact, Ukraine was positioned in between the two blocs for quite some time, and Yanukovych was trying to play one against the other and preserve a certain degree of mobility or flexibility of the Ukrainian government. Partly because Ukraine is next door to Russia. There is a huge section of its population who speaks Russian or are ethnically Russians. A lot of its economy is tied up to Russia. It has to sell to, or used to sell to Russia. And therefore, its natural trading partner was Russia. Right. As against this, trying to tie up to the West has the problems that it would mean that what Ukraine would supply would therefore be only raw materials or its people. And that was not going to give Ukraine as good terms of integration or trade as the trade with Russia was. Therefore, Yanukovych was trying to play both sides. But all of it collapsed because, as you know, the Maidan revolt, which was backed by various forces, including obviously NATO, and you had US senior government officials of the United States going in and even talking to the Maidan people, at the end of which Yanukovych ran away, essentially, and Poroshenko came into power. Now, what is forgotten is there is a larger picture here of NATO, which, when the negotiations had taken place over Germany, was supposed to stop at the German borders. This was the assurance given to Gorbachev during that time, that if you let Germany reunify, then the NATO's eastward march would not take place. It would stop in Germany. Not only didn't it stop, but it advanced in the Baltics, it advanced with Poland, it advanced with Romania, and now the next one was Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Now it is really ringing in whole of Russia with NATO countries, and also mounting various missile brigades over there, which can hit Russia, including strategic missiles. Right. All of this was called anti-ballistic missiles, but as you know, the difference between ballistic missiles and anti-ballistic missiles is not that significant. It can be turned one to the other quite easily. So all of this is what Russia was reacting to, and this is, in a longer sense term, is a huge issue for Europe, because it means Russia should be ringed in. The battle over dominance of Europe will be waged between really the United States via its proxies, and Western Europe essentially would not be able to integrate in the Eurasian landmass, which is really Russia and China, the big markets, and lower down with India, but they would be tied up to the United States. This is the larger geostrategic picture when we talk about Ukraine. And it's also interesting to see, actually, whenever a Ukraine ceasefire has been announced or has been negotiated, it has been with the European countries and Russia along with the Ukrainian forces, and unfortunately most of those agreements have remained dead on water because the United States didn't back them at all. In fact, it backed the other side. Zelensky came into power with the argument that we will seek peace because one part of Ukraine, which is also ethnically Russian, has decided that it doesn't want to be part of what the Maidan regime brought out, which was old-fashioned Nazis, and they had been a part of Hitler's armies, they had been a part of the pogroms over there against the Jews, and they essentially were the ones. And there are again forces which have been openly talked about as fascist forces by European countries and by even the United States. So those are the forces who had dominated the Ukrainian government and wanted a fight with first the eastern part of Ukraine, which was fighting to keep its autonomy and wanted to secede virtually, which the Russians have backed politically, but not for secession.
Right.
So they want a more autonomous eastern Ukraine and not an Eastern Europe, which tries to become a part of Russia. So that Russians have never supported. But effectively what has happened is any attempt to reach peace has been sabotaged. Zelensky again came on the platform that he wanted to settle the issue with Eastern Ukraine and also reach some agreement with Russia and try for a peace with Ukraine. This seems to be anathema to a section of the Democratic Party who have talked about Trump and Ukraine's tie-up and the fact that Trump tried to pressurize Zelensky to investigate Biden. Now, we've discussed this earlier. The question is, Trump seems to have acted crudely. Presidents of the United States, of course, do all of these things. But do they do it that openly? Do they pick up a phone and call the president of another country, do this or do that? Those questions will leave to the US Senate and the US Congress. The point that I'm making is, the issue, if you take Ukraine and Russia, then obviously this is a much more a matter of Europe. And the fact that we are seeing the Democratic Party claim that Trump is some way or the other a stooge of Putin, a stooge of A, stooge of B, and is trying to do various things, actually exposes that this country today, the United States, cannot really sign any agreement, because if one side signs agreement, other side pulls out. We saw Trump pulling out of the Iran agreement.
Right.
And now we see Ukraine, whatever they do, whichever party comes into power, if they want to, for us to settle Ukraine, then they will get Iran. If they settle Iran, then they will get Ukraine.
Right.
This seems to be the kind of policies each party is playing with the other. And the net result is we really have a situation where no peace is possible anywhere in the world, because the United States domestic squabbles will see to it, whether it's Iran or it's Ukraine, a peace doesn't take place.
Right. And what we're also seeing is that the Democratic Party, in its as part of its campaign to discredit and definitely, if possible, try to impeach Trump, is actually legitimizing the understanding that the US by default is a country which has the right to interfere anywhere in the world. Because among other things, Joe Biden openly went on record to boast how he had helped overthrow that government. And so this is one aspect that's never really being questioned in these hearings at all, because even those career diplomats who testified during the hearings and spoke out against Trump were widely celebrated. But the underlying aspect that they all supported, we are supposed to be the global policeman, has not been questioned at all.
Well, that's the interesting part, because all of them are talking about that opening investigations against what Biden and his son were doing in Ukraine is somehow a treasonous
Exactly.
affair. But openly subverting Ukraine's democracy, Ukraine's limited, shall we say, democratic elections, that's entirely legitimate.
Exactly.
And this is also part of what the US has done. If you remember, there was a Time magazine year cover which celebrated that the United States won the election for Yeltsin. Okay? Nobody contests that. Nobody says, well, that wasn't supposed to be done. The United States has openly, militarily invaded, I think, in the last 50 years, more than 90 countries. Nobody questions that in the United States till the body bags come home, which it did in Vietnam. Otherwise, it's perfectly okay as long as it is drones, it is other instruments of war, not directly people, the United States losing its soldiers. So this is one part of it. But if you take the question of Ukraine itself, there is also enough grounds to show that the Democrats have been involved with Ukraine or Ukrainians in the US elections, in 2016 elections. If you argue that Trump was being helped by the Russians, again, as we have said earlier also, the click farm which were trying to get clicks on both sides. The fact they got more clicks from Trump's is simply the fact that Trump's supporters are probably more active in such clickbait operations, and they're more prey to fake news than other parties are. But if you leave that out, there were clear Ukrainian fingerprints against Trump because they thought that the Trump could mean some rapprochement with Russia, and this is not in the interest of the Poroshenko regime at that time. And they were trying to help, it's argued. There is Chalupa, who was a part of the Democratic National Committee's effort. She was a contractor there. There's an argument that CrowdStrike is a ethnic Ukrainian who runs that company, though a US citizen, and somehow the CrowdStrike fingered the Russians without much evidence. And even today, those servers of the Democratic National Committee has never been forensically examined by the US intelligence agencies, though they have given reports regarding that, but based purely appears on the CrowdStrike report. So all of this would seem to indicate that intervention in US elections is all right, as long as it happens to see that the Russians are the main enemy. If there is any attempt to have a rapprochement, even which is the interest of the United States itself, that should be abjured. And this is really a part of what I would say is the continuance dominance of the war lobby in the United States and what somebody has called the never-ending wars, which the US today sees it as its primary economic activity. War industry of different kinds is what really drives the US economy, and therefore they can never let go of the wars. And I think one of the articles that I saw recently, written by an ex-army officer, is that as the wars become against smaller and smaller countries that the US wages, the number of medals the generals wear on their chest seems to be growing. Now apparently the generals have 7 rows of medals on their chest, while after the Second World War they had only 3. So you can see that there is a war industry and there is a war veteran industry, which is decided by how many medals you get. And that is what you wear to the TV stations. And that determines also the amount of money you get as a consultant and as a media commentator.
Right. And finally, to look at the impact of all this inside the United States itself. Like you mentioned, this is an extremely complicated process. And the Democrats themselves seem to be in a bit of a fix. There is one side arguing against doing any of these proceedings. There's one side calling for a censure motion, which would basically end the impeachment process there. And there's definitely a hardline side which wants to go ahead with the impeachment process nonetheless. So do you think that if this process does go ahead, there is any possibility of Trump actually being affected by any of these proceedings, or is he actually likely to benefit?
One thing is the crystal ball gazing for predicting elections, a very, very risky exercise. If I look at the crystal ball, I have not been a very successful one. It came to Indian elections. So why should I be better off on the United States elections? I would say the core base of Trump does not seem to be affected by this, by all the figures that we see of the polls that are taken right now regarding which section approves or doesn't approve of Trump. Interestingly enough, Trump's base does not seem to have shifted.
Right.
So the elections then boil down to what is called also the Electoral College. And that does not correlate with population because you know Hillary won 3 million more votes than Trump did, except Trump won the Electoral College. Right. So as long as you have the Electoral College skewed towards those states which have less people but comparatively more representation in the Electoral College, I think Trump seems to be safe. There are 3 or 4 states,
swing states,
which are called the swing states, but that would depend on who the Democrats put up.
Right.
If they put up somebody like Biden, somebody like now the guy who has thrown his hat in the ring, the former mayor
Michael Bloomberg.
Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, and a billionaire. He's going to throw his billions into the ring. Of course, Trump is a failed billionaire because his real estate business actually always made losses. And he's the richest bankrupt American ever, probably. But if you take Bloomberg or Biden, I don't think Trump would really face a problem. If it came against somebody who also can turn against him the base which is affected by all that's happening in the United States, like Bernie Sanders, then I think you could have a different kind of election. But looking at the fact that Democratic National Committee is really in hock to the Clinton machinery, I don't think there is any chance of their being able to get the nomination. So you are looking at a weak opposition finally to Trump. And I don't think that with the Senate majority that Trump has, there is any chance of an impeachment finally going through. So what you're seeing is a shift from the real policies that today bedevil the United States, how to shore up its flagging infrastructure. It's really, if you go to the United States, you will see that for instance, the airports, the roads, all of this really look relatively third world, shall we say, that compared to what you see in China, for example. So I think this is the crisis that the US, all the political parties want not to face.
Right.
And the result, therefore, is talking about how to make America great again and how to fight a few more wars. Trump has not withdrawn from our war. He has sent more soldiers to Syria. He wants a war with Iran. He has done shadow boxing with North Korea, but almost brought it to war at one point. So it's not that there has been any change in Trump's war policies, except that he wants to fight a different set of countries than what the Democrats want to fight. So I think both sides really are looking at policies which distract attention of the people from the real issues. And as long as that continues, if a Biden wins, a Trump wins, or a Bloomberg wins,
right,
I don't think it's going to make a difference to the rest of the world. Right. We are still going to see the United States wage war against the people of the world and against the planet itself, if we look at climate change to other things that are happening.
Right. Thank you, Prabir. That's all we have time for today. Keep watching NewsClick.